A powerful millionaire insulted his loyal nanny for her skin and status, but karma had other plans. Hello, dear viewers. I'm Alcot Brian, and I'm so thrilled to have you join me here today. Whether you've been with us for a while or are a new member of our community, I want to extend the warmest welcome to you all. Here at Alcot Stories, we believe in the power of storytelling to heal, inspire, and bring us together. As we gather together through these stories, I want to take a moment to say a loving prayer for you all. Your hearts be filled with peace, your spirits be lifted with hope, and your minds be open to the beauty and lessons that each story brings. Find comfort in the words and strength in the journeys we share. May love surround you, and may joy light your path. Amen. Joining for the first time, I'd like to kindly ask you to hit that subscribe button. Join our growing family, where we share not just stories, but experiences that touch the heart. Click the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the magic we create together. Thank you for being here. I'm honored to be your storyteller. Let's dive into this journey together. Stay tuned for more amazing tales, and always remember, your story matters too. Elise Rowe sat silently in the corner of their grand living room, staring out the window at the sprawling city skyline. The air was thick with an uneasy quiet that had become the backdrop of her life over the past few years. The grand mansion, perched on a hill with a panoramic view, had always felt like a prison to her. Every corner, every opulent piece of furniture, and every empty echo within its walls reminded her that she was living in a house that wasn't truly hers. She wasn't part of the world Edward Sinclair, her husband, had built. To him, she was merely a tool, an accessory to fulfill a promise made by his late father, a promise neither she nor Edward had ever truly agreed upon. Their marriage, like the pristine, sterile home, had been arranged for business, for status, and for appearances. She was a black woman, married to a wealthy white millionaire. But there was no love, only obligation, duty, and disdain. His cold eyes often swept over her with barely disguised indifference, as if she were nothing more than an expensive possession in a collection of finer things, something to show off at parties, but never something to cherish. Edward was a man obsessed with beauty, specifically the beauty of white women, and wealth. He surrounded himself with women who were not only physically stunning, but who also reflected the status he had worked tirelessly to build. Elise had known this from the moment they were married. She knew she didn't fit his ideal, and she didn't belong in his world. He would often spend hours at high-end charity events or board meetings, mingling with other millionaires, their wives, their mistresses, women whose laughter filled the room with lightness, while Elise remained a shadow in the background. At every event, she was forced to smile, play the part, and pretend that the weight in her chest wasn't suffocating her. She would serve drinks at parties and stand silently in the background, observing the world that would never accept her. And when Edward glanced at her, it was only to give her orders, to remind her of her role. He would never introduce her as his wife. It was as if he couldn't bear to claim her as his own. Instead, she was often introduced as a distant relative, a cousin from out of town, or, if the situation called for it, a friend. His friends never looked her in the eye, never acknowledged her as anything other than a fleeting presence in their midst. Elise's heart ached with every passing day, but she buried her pain deep behind a veil of grace and patience. She held on to hope, the hope that one day things might change. Maybe Edward would look at her with kindness, with admiration, maybe even love. But day after day, the distance between them only grew. It was a strange kind of loneliness, one that came not from physical isolation, but from the lack of connection. Edward was a man of cold, calculated logic, someone who saw emotions as a weakness, something that could be exploited or disregarded. To him, love was a commodity, something to be bought, packaged, and sold. And Elise, despite the affection she felt for him, was not worthy of his love. As she poured a cup of tea, she watched him from across the room. He was sitting at his desk, engrossed in a series of financial reports, his sharp features furrowed in concentration. She had grown used to the sight of him in his world of spreadsheets, high-stakes deals, and business transactions. He had built his empire on the back of ruthless ambition, and nothing was going to stop him from achieving his goals. He often joked that he had no time for anything but money. His obsession with wealth was all-consuming, and it had seeped into every part of their lives, leaving little room for the things that truly mattered. Love, compassion, empathy. These were foreign concepts to Edward. And yet, despite it all, Elise had remained loyal. She had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, in the idea that love could grow and blossom if nurtured. She had tried, oh, how she had tried, to make their union work. She would cook for him, speak softly to him, try to make him see the value of kindness, of understanding. But each time she reached out, her efforts were met with indifference. It was as though he had constructed a wall around himself, a wall that nothing, no matter how genuine, could breach. Elise wasn't blind. She knew that she wasn't the type of woman Edward truly desired. He'd always been infatuated with fair skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes, the quintessential image of beauty in his world. She had heard the whispered conversations between Edward and his business associates, had seen the way his eyes lingered on other women, women who resembled the models he surrounded himself with in magazine covers. Elise was never meant to fit that mold. She was too dark, too different, and yet, in her quiet way, she loved him. She loved him despite his cruelty, despite his inability to see her as anything more than a trophy wife in a business deal. She loved him because she believed in the possibility of change, in the belief that love could heal. But the more she loved him, the more she realized that she was pouring water into a vessel with cracks so deep that it would never hold. One evening, as she placed his dinner in front of him, she tried to make a joke to lighten the mood. He glanced up briefly, gave her a curt nod, and then returned to his phone. The silence in the room grew heavy, and Elise's shoulders sagged. She had become nothing more than a shadow in her own home, a presence that went unnoticed. She had hoped for something more, something real, something warm. But all she had was this house, this marriage, and the crushing weight of solitude. "Edward," she whispered softly, though she knew he wouldn't hear her. "I wish you could see me." But he never did. The woman who stood before him, the woman who had sacrificed everything to be with him, was nothing more than a ghost in his eyes. She was just a black woman in his white world, an afterthought, a burden, a mistake that could never be undone. The only thing that was real in his world was his wealth and the women who matched his ideal. "Elise, bring me the other bottle of wine," he muttered, not even looking up. Her heart sank. Another command, another moment of invisibility. As she moved toward the wine cabinet, she thought, "I will always be invisible to you." The silence in the house was suffocating. the kind of silence that felt as though it was not merely the absence of sound, but the weight of unspoken truths that hung thick in the air, a constant presence that Elise could never escape. She moved through the corridors, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floors, as if she were trying to avoid disturbing the stillness that consumed everything. She had become so used to this cold, unyielding emptiness, that she no longer thought of it as something that could change. It was just the way things were, the way they had always been. And yet there were moments when she allowed herself to dream of what life could have been. If only Edward had seen her, if only he had noticed her as more than just a tool for his ambitions. But those moments were fleeting, swallowed quickly by the reality that she had no place in his world, no role to play, beyond that of an obedient wife who silently accepted her fate. She had been born into a family that had taught her resilience, that had instilled in her the quiet strength to endure the hardships life threw at her. But this was different. This was a slow, insidious kind of pain, the kind that wore you down bit by bit until there was nothing left but the hollow echo of your own existence. She had spent so many nights lying awake in their vast, cold bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had gone wrong. Was it her? Was she not enough? Was there something about her that Edward couldn't love? She had tried with every fibre of her being to be the woman he needed, the wife he had demanded. She had tried to be everything to him, submissive when needed, strong when required, quiet when silence was the only option. But it was never enough. Not for him, not for this man who had built his empire on the backs of others, on the exploitation of everything he considered valuable, from the people in his life to the money in his bank account. Elise had long understood that he saw her as nothing more than a pawn in a game he didn't even care to acknowledge, a woman who was expected to serve him, to be silent and unseen. She had tried to tell herself that it was okay, that maybe things would change with time. After all, she had heard the stories, the fairy tales of husbands who eventually came to realize the value of their wives, who, after years of neglect, finally saw the strength and beauty they had ignored for so long. But those stories were just that, stories. And Elise was beginning to realize that her life was not a fairy tale. It was something far darker, far more painful, and far more real. She had learned to be strong, but the strength had come at a price. Her heart, once open and full of warmth, had closed off over the years, turning to stone in the face of Edward's indifference. She no longer cried. She no longer begged for his attention. It was pointless. Instead, she went through the motions, serving him, cooking for him, doing everything that was expected of her, even though she knew it was all for nothing. It had been months since they had shared a genuine conversation, let alone an intimate moment. The thought of intimacy, of closeness, seemed like something from a distant past, something that belonged to a time when their marriage had held more promise, when their lives had seemed full of potential. But now, every moment felt like a reminder of the gulf that separated them, a gulf that had only widened over the years. And so, she poured herself into her work. It was the one thing that gave her some semblance of purpose, the one thing that allowed her to feel like she mattered, if only for a brief moment. She started attending local charity events, speaking at fundraisers, working with organizations that supported women of color. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was her way of telling the world that she was more than just Edward Sinclair's wife, that she was someone with her own voice, her own identity. But even that felt like a distant, futile effort, like a drop of water trying to fill an ocean. No one cared about the black woman who stood in the shadows of the powerful white men. She could feel the stares, the whispers behind her back, the way people looked down on her as though she didn't belong in the same room. The irony was that the more she tried to assert herself, the more invisible she became. The more she fought to be seen, the more she was pushed to the margins. Edward's indifference didn't just hurt. It was a constant, living thing that gnawed at her every waking moment. It had settled deep inside her, like a weight that she could never shake off. And yet, she still held on to a shred of hope. A hope that somehow things would get better. That maybe one day Edward would look at her and see the woman she truly was. The woman who had stood by him, who had supported him through every triumph and every failure. The woman who had loved him without question, without hesitation. But each passing day felt like a reminder that hope, like everything else in her life, was a luxury she could no longer afford. One evening, Elise returned home later than usual. She had been at a fundraiser for a local non-profit that helped disadvantaged women, an event that had brought a brief sense of purpose into her life. But as she entered the house, she was met with the same cold silence. Edward's car was parked in the driveway, but there were no signs of life in the house. The door to his study was ajar, and through the crack she could see him sitting at his desk, focused on his laptop. She knew better than to disturb him. He would be lost in his work for hours, indifferent to her presence, just as he always was. Elise stood there for a moment, looking at him through the open door, and a pang of sadness filled her chest. She wasn't even sure why she still bothered to look for him, to try to find something, anything, that could bridge the distance between them. It had been years since she had stopped trying to be the perfect wife, and yet she still couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed in some way. As she turned to head up the stairs, she noticed a flicker of light from the corner of her eye. The living room, usually dark at this hour, was illuminated by the glow of a television screen. Elise froze, her heart skipping a beat. She knew that look, the way the light flickered in the shadows, the soft hum of a voice coming from the screen. It was Sabrina, the woman who had been a fixture in Edward's life for months, the woman who had slowly but surely taken the place in his heart that Elise had once hoped to fill. She had known about Sabrina for a while, but tonight the reality of it hit her like a slap in the face. She wasn't just an invisible presence in Edward's world anymore. She was no longer a wife at all. She was nothing. Elise took a deep breath and turned away. There was no point in confronting him. There was no point in asking questions she already knew the answers to. There was no point in begging for something that would never be given. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at the table, staring into the empty night. This was her life now, quiet, solitary, and bound to a man who would never see her for who she truly was. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. Elise sat at the kitchen table, her glass of water untouched, as the weight of her thoughts pressed heavily on her chest. She could hear the faint murmurs of voices from the living room, Sabrina's laughter, the kind of laughter that could fill any room, that could make any man weak in the knees. It wasn't the kind of laugh that was directed at her or toward her. It was the kind of laugh that filled the air between her and Edward with such distance that it seemed like a taunt, a reminder of everything she could never be. The realization crashed over her like a wave, the sting of the truth seeping into her skin until it burned. Edward didn't love her, had never loved her. He had simply chosen her out of convenience, a woman to parade around on his arm when he needed her. A black woman to complete the image he wanted to project. A trophy wife, a symbol of success that could be easily discarded when no longer needed. She had always known there was someone else, but hearing Sabrina's voice, light and sweet as it sounded from the other room, made everything real. Sabrina, with her golden hair, her perfect smile, her delicate features, everything Edward had ever wanted in a woman, and everything Elise could never be. Elise stood up slowly, her legs feeling heavy, as if the floor beneath her had become too thick to walk on. She left the glass of water behind, the faint reflection of her own image in its surface, now just another distant figure she didn't recognize. She quietly moved towards the stairs, trying not to make a sound, but she knew there was no point. The house was empty of everything but her. No one was going to stop her. No one was even paying attention to her anymore. She walked up the stairs, each step feeling like it took a little piece of her with it, until she reached the top and stood before the bedroom door. She hadn't been in their bedroom for days. The bed, once a place where they had shared whispers and promises of forever, was now just a cold, sterile space, a reminder of everything they had lost. Elise turned the handle slowly, knowing what she would find inside. There was nothing left of the man she had once hoped to love. Edward wasn't there. The bed was empty, the room still except for the lingering scent of something sweet in the air. It wasn't Sabrina's perfume. It was a sweet, familiar scent, one that reminded Elise of her own grandmother's house, of family dinners, of safety. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the memories to wash over her before the bitterness of her reality swept them away. She had never felt more alone. Walking out of the room, Elise made her way downstairs again, her movements slow but purposeful. She didn't know why she was doing this, why she was still trying to hold on, still searching for some piece of the man she had once hoped to build a life with. But the answer was clear. It was love. Or at least, it had been. She had loved him, and that love, even in its most painful form, was still a part of her. As she passed the living room door, she caught sight of them. Edward and Sabrina, sitting on the couch, their heads tilted toward each other, their laughter filling the room, their eyes locked in that private, intimate way that Elise had never once received. The scene was a slap in the face, but it wasn't the first one. Edward hadn't touched her in months, hadn't looked at her with any affection in years. She had become a shadow in her own home, a servant to his whims, a figurehead in a marriage that was little more than a facade. Sabrina wasn't just the other woman. She was everything Elise could never be. She had the world Edward craved, the beauty he wanted, and the power he adored. She was everything that Elise was not. The thought twisted in Elise's stomach, a mixture of anger and despair curling up like a snake inside her. "I was never enough," Elise whispered to herself, the words tasting bitter as they left her lips. She didn't expect an answer, didn't expect any kind of response. But she stood there, staring at the two of them, wondering how it had come to this, wondering where it had all gone wrong. And then, without a single word, without any warning, Edward glanced up. His gaze met hers, briefly, just long enough for her to see the flash of something in his eyes. Was it guilt? Regret? No, it was indifference. It always was. He didn't even bother to apologize, didn't even acknowledge her presence. He simply turned back to Sabrina, as though Elise were nothing but a fleeting image that no longer mattered. That moment, that single glance, was enough to snap something deep inside Elise. She didn't care anymore. She didn't care about his indifference. She didn't care about the fact that he had never loved her. Never would. What mattered now was her own survival. She had been living in his shadow for too long, allowing herself to be crushed under the weight of his neglect. No more. Elise took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then opened them again. The woman who stood in the doorway was no longer the same one who had walked in a few minutes ago. She was someone different now. The realization, painful as it was, had ignited something within her. The woman who had once loved Edward with all her heart was gone. The woman who had spent years trying to prove her worth, to earn his love, to earn a place in his world, she was gone too. What remained was a woman who had nothing left to lose. Elise didn't wait for a response, didn't give herself time to second-guess her decision. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the front door, her footsteps quick, her heart pounding with newfound resolve. It wasn't for Edward anymore. It wasn't even for her broken heart. It was for her. "I'm more than this," she whispered under her breath as she stepped out of the house, the cool night air hitting her skin. And for the first time in years, Elise felt something that had been missing for so long. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was life beyond the confines of this house, beyond the man who had never truly seen her. It was a step into the unknown, a step toward reclaiming her own voice. But it was the first step she had taken for herself in years, and that alone was enough to keep her moving forward. The night air felt different now, fresher, more alive, as if the world itself were acknowledging her decision. Elise had stepped outside into the cool, unforgiving darkness, but for the first time in years, it no longer felt like a vast void. The sound of her footsteps on the cracked sidewalk was no longer a reminder of her insignificance, but a declaration of her newfound purpose. She had left the house, the mansion, the symbol of her past life, without a plan, without knowing where she would go or what she would do. All she knew was that she could no longer remain a passive figure in a life that was suffocating her. With each step, her resolve grew stronger. The silence that had once felt like a weight around her chest now felt like a canvas, empty but full of potential, waiting to be filled with something of her own choosing. She didn't care about the shadows that followed her, the whispers of doubt that crept into her mind. This is it, she told herself. The words almost a chant, a mantra she needed to repeat in order to believe them. Elise had spent so much time waiting for something to change, for Edward to finally see her, for someone to recognize her worth. But now she knew that was never going to happen. She was the only one who could change her story. It was terrifying, the thought of stepping into the unknown, with nothing but the strength she had left to carry her forward. But it was also liberating. Her heart beat with the rhythm of someone who had just been given a second chance. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she couldn't go back to the life she had been living. As she walked through the streets, her mind began to clear. It was late, the city quiet and desolate, but in the emptiness, she found space to breathe. Elise had always been the type of woman who kept her emotions tightly guarded, especially after years of feeling small in Edward's shadow. She had become accustomed to silence, to the stillness that filled her days. But now she felt a stir deep within her, a slow but steady awakening. Her anger, her frustration, and her sadness were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but they no longer controlled her. For the first time in years, Elise was allowing herself to feel the full force of her emotions, and it was both overwhelming and empowering. She wasn't angry just at Edward anymore. She was angry at herself. Angry at the woman who had been so willing to sacrifice everything for a man who would never value her. She had let herself become invisible, to be pushed aside by a man who saw her as nothing more than an accessory to his life. She had allowed herself to shrink in the hopes that he would see her, love her, appreciate her, but she had been wrong. She had been wrong to think that she could find validation through someone else's gaze. The truth was simple and undeniable now. She had been enough all along. Elise stopped walking for a moment, standing in the middle of the deserted street as she let that truth settle into her bones. She had spent so long believing that she wasn't good enough, that she wasn't worthy of love. But now, in this moment, she knew better. She wasn't the problem. It was the world around her, a world that had never truly embraced her, never truly seen her. And now, it was time for her to take control. Elise wasn't sure where her journey would lead, but she knew it would be hers. There was a feeling in her chest, like a fire beginning to burn, something deep and primal that had been waiting for the right moment to ignite. "I will rise," she whispered to herself, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "I will rise, and no one will stop me." As she continued walking, she found herself at a small cafe, the kind that served strong coffee and had the faint smell of pastries lingering in the air. It was quiet inside, the few patrons lost in their own thoughts. She stepped in, the warmth of the cafe wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. The barista behind the counter gave her a polite nod, but Elise didn't notice. She didn't notice anything except the quiet hum of life continuing on without her, the world moving forward as if it had never paused for her pain. She ordered a coffee and sat in a corner, staring out the window at the city stretching before her. She didn't know what her next step would be, but she knew she had to start somewhere. "This is my life now," she thought, taking a slow sip of her coffee. It tasted bitter, but in a way, it mirrored how she felt. Bitter, but alive. She spent the next few hours in the cafe, lost in thought, her mind racing with possibilities. She had nothing left to lose. She could rebuild. She could do something she never thought she would be able to do. Live for herself. It was the strangest feeling, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that the only thing left to do was jump. There was no safety net, no promise of a soft landing. But she had no choice. She had already fallen too far to turn back now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. It was a message from one of her friends, someone who had always been supportive, but never quite understood the full extent of Elise's pain. "Elise, I've been thinking about you. I know things are tough, but you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you, whenever you're ready to talk." Elise stared at the message, feeling a mix of gratitude and sadness. She was grateful for her friends, for the people who cared about her. But she knew something had shifted inside her. She couldn't rely on others to fix her anymore. She had to fix herself. The journey would be long, and it would be hard, but Elise wasn't afraid anymore. "This is just the beginning," she told herself, taking another sip of her coffee. The decision had been made. She was going to rebuild her life from the ground up. Elise didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was no longer afraid of it. The darkness that had once seemed so overwhelming no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a blank slate, a place where she could start over, with nothing but her strength and her resolve to guide her. And as she finished her coffee, she stood up, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that no matter how many times life knocked her down, she would rise. She would rise. The days that followed Elise's departure from the mansion felt like a blur, half-formed memories of moments spent navigating a world she had long since forgotten how to face. The city streets, once foreign to her in their cold anonymity, now felt oddly familiar, almost comforting in their indifference. She no longer had the luxury of belonging to the gilded world she had been a part of, nor did she have the luxury of being someone else's definition of herself. I am no longer anyone's possession, Elise thought, the simple realization ringing through her like a bell. She had once been a figure in Edward's shadow, reduced to little more than an ornament in a mansion filled with empty promises. But now, standing in the midst of the world's chaos, Elise finally felt the stirrings of her own voice, her own truth. It was hard, though. Every inch of her body, every ounce of her spirit screamed for rest. The emotional toll of years of being ignored, underestimated, and unloved left its marks on her, each scar a painful reminder of the life she had lived. But there was something different now. A fire, small but burning steadily. She had taken the first step into the unknown, and though it was terrifying, it was also the most liberating choice she had ever made. She had left behind the security, the opulence, the lifestyle that had been promised to her. The house, with its marble floors and high ceilings, felt like a distant dream now, an unattainable life that was never truly hers. Now, Elise found herself in a small apartment in the heart of the city, a space that was modest but hers. It wasn't the mansion she had once shared with Edward, but it was real. It was a space that echoed her newfound sense of independence. She would make it her own, no matter how small the space. Each morning she woke to the sounds of the city, a stark contrast to the silence that had reigned in the mansion, a silence that had been broken only by Edward's dismissive words and Sabrina's occasional laugh. The city, with its chaos and life, offered a kind of freedom Elise had never known. She could walk the streets without anyone watching her, without anyone judging her for what she wore, how she looked, or who she was. It was a strange feeling, one she had never imagined she would experience. I'm finally free, she thought, but that freedom didn't come without a price. Her mind was often filled with uncertainty, and there were days when the weight of the unknown felt too much to bear. Elise had learned, over the years, to adapt. She had learned to be resilient, to survive in a world that had never offered her true protection or understanding. But now, for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for the woman she had once been, for the dreams she had long put aside. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision, this new chapter of her life, one that was entirely her own. But the hardest part, Elise soon realized, was facing the world without Edward. She had spent years shaping herself to fit into his world, tailoring her identity to meet his needs, always adjusting to his desires. She had been conditioned to believe that her worth was tied to him, to the approval of others. Now she had to learn how to live without that validation. She spent her days trying to adjust to a routine, going through the motions, searching for something that would anchor her. But it was hard. Some nights, when the city was silent and the apartment felt too big for just her, Elise would sit on the edge of her bed and stare out the window, wondering if she was doing the right thing. What if I can't make it on my own? That thought haunted her more than she would like to admit. The fear of failure, of falling flat on her face, weighed on her shoulders like an invisible shackle. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had known, every aspect of her life, had been a lie. I don't even know who I am anymore, she thought one night, as she stared at her reflection in the window. The woman who looked back at her seemed like a stranger. She was no longer the wife of Edward, no longer a woman who had lived under someone else's expectations. She was simply Elise, a woman standing on her own, trying to carve a path that was entirely hers. But every step forward felt like a journey into a foreign land, a place where nothing was familiar. There were moments of doubt, of longing for the comfort of the life she had known, for the security of knowing her place in the world. But those moments were fleeting. Elise was beginning to see the cracks of the illusion she had built for herself. The life she had once thought was perfect. She wasn't the victim anymore. She wasn't the woman whose worth was defined by the man beside her. She was a woman reborn, stronger than she had ever known. And that realization was both terrifying and beautiful. Elise knew that there would be setbacks. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be moments when she would doubt herself, when she would want to give up and crawl back into the comfort of the life she had once known. But those moments would not define her. What would define her was her resilience, the strength to keep going, to keep fighting for herself. She had the power to reclaim her life. Elise spent the next few weeks finding her footing. She sought therapy, something she had never considered before, and began to process the years of hurt and trauma that had accumulated inside her. She started to rebuild herself, piece by piece, starting with the way she saw herself. She began to rediscover the things that had made her happy before she had given herself away to Edward. She started drawing again, picking up the sketchbook she had abandoned long ago. She rekindled friendships with people who hadn't judged her, who had supported her from the sidelines when Edward had made her feel small. Slowly but surely, Elise began to rebuild her identity. Not as a wife, not as a possession, but as a woman in her own right. "This is me. This is who I am," Elise told herself one morning as she gazed into the mirror. Her reflection had changed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. She had broken free from the chains of her past, and for the first time in years, Elise felt alive. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was no longer afraid to find out. As she stood up and walked out the door, ready to face another day, she knew one thing for sure: she was going to make it. No matter what happened, Elise would rise. She would rise. As Elise stepped into the unknown, a sense of nervous excitement washed over her. She had made it through the hardest part, the decision to leave her old life behind. And now, with every passing day, she was starting to understand just how strong she had always been. The world, once a blur of towering buildings and unfamiliar streets, had begun to feel less like an enemy and more like a place where she could carve out her own destiny. The woman who had once been defined by the expectations of others, by the judgment of those who never truly saw her, was finally free. She no longer had to worry about living up to someone else's standards. She could stand tall in the knowledge that she was the architect of her own future, no longer shackled by the constraints of a life she had never chosen. But even as she embraced this new version of herself, Elise was constantly confronted with the harsh reality of her decisions. The fear of failure was always there, lurking in the back of her mind, like a shadow that refused to leave. Every time she stepped into the world outside her apartment, she felt a little unsure, a little afraid. The path she was forging was unfamiliar, and there were days when she felt as like she was fumbling in the dark, unsure of where to place her next step. But even on those days, something inside her told her to keep going. She had seen what she was capable of. She had faced the worst of her fears and walked away with her head held high. "I won't stop," she whispered to herself, the words a promise. Elise knew that this journey would not be a straight line. There would be detours, moments of uncertainty, and even failures. But there would also be triumphs, moments of realization and growth. She wasn't who she had been a year ago. She wasn't the woman who had allowed herself to be overlooked and dismissed. She had taken control, and now she was learning how to live for herself. One of the first steps in her new life was finding a job. Elise had never had to worry about work before. Edward's wealth had provided everything for her, and her days had been filled with shopping trips, charity galas, and dinners with people whose names she could barely remember. Now she needed to earn her own way, and she was determined to do it on her terms. She started small, applying for entry-level jobs in graphic design, a field she had always loved, but had set aside in favor of living a life dictated by someone else's vision. It wasn't easy. The rejections came quickly, each one a sharp reminder that the world didn't owe her anything. But Elise wasn't discouraged. She had spent too long living in fear of rejection, of not being good enough. Now, with every no, she simply learned to grow stronger. She tweaked her resume, honed her portfolio, and pushed forward, undeterred by the setbacks. Her first real breakthrough came when she was offered a freelance job designing logos for a local startup. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The excitement she felt when she completed the project, when she saw her work come to life, was indescribable. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming a part of herself that she had long forgotten. Elise threw herself into her work, pouring all of her creativity and passion into every design. Her self-doubt, though still present, became a background hum, drowned out by the sheer joy of doing something she loved. She began to realize that for the first time in years, she was working for something that was entirely her own. The work was satisfying, but it was also challenging. The clients could be demanding, and the deadlines were tight. But each challenge only made her more resilient. She learned how to navigate the world on her own terms, to stand her ground when things got difficult, and to take pride in what she was building. Elise had begun to see the value in herself, not just as a wife, not just as a woman who existed to serve the whims of others, but as an individual with talent, intelligence, and potential. One evening, after completing a particularly difficult project, Elise collapsed onto her couch, exhausted but elated. She was starting to see the fruits of her labor, and while there were still so many obstacles ahead, she could feel herself growing into the woman she had always been meant to be. But just as Elise was beginning to settle into her new life, her past came rushing back. A message appeared on her phone one morning from an unknown number. "It's time we talked. You can't keep running away from this. Edward wants to speak to you." Her heart skipped a beat, the familiar pang of anxiety rising in her chest. The message was from one of Edward's lawyers, and it hit her like a punch to the gut. The past she had been trying so hard to leave behind was now knocking at her door. For a brief moment, Elise considered ignoring it, dismissing the message as just another way for Edward to manipulate her. But then she remembered how far she had come, how much she had fought to get to this point. "I'm not running anymore," she thought, her jaw setting with determination. She needed to face him. Face the man who had once been everything to her. The man who had shattered her belief in love. The man who had taken so much from her. Elise called the number back, her hands shaking slightly as she held the phone to her ear. The voice on the other end was cold and formal, as if the words were pre-scripted. "Mr. Edward Moore requests a meeting with you. He believes it is time for you to discuss the divorce settlement and other financial matters. He insists that this is the only way forward." Elise didn't respond immediately. She knew that this was a trap, a way for Edward to reassert control over her life, to make her feel like she was still somehow beneath him. But she was no longer that woman. "I will meet with him," she said, her voice steady, even though her heart was racing. "But on my terms." The meeting was set for the following week. As Elise prepared herself for what was sure to be a tense encounter, she realized just how far she had come. This was no longer about seeking validation from Edward or anyone else. This was about reclaiming her power, about standing firm in her decisions. When the day arrived, she dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made her feel confident, something that reflected the woman she had become. The meeting was held in a sleek, cold office downtown, Edward's domain. He had always liked to surround himself with symbols of power, with reminders that he was in control. But this time, as Elise walked into the room, she felt no fear. The man sitting at the desk, once the center of her world, seemed small now. "I'm here for me," she thought as she met his gaze. The conversation that followed was tense, full of legal jargon and accusations, but Elise remained calm. She knew she had nothing to prove anymore. The settlement was finalized, and though there was still a part of her that felt bitterness rise at the memory of the years she had wasted, there was also a sense of peace. She was done with him. Elise walked out of that office with her head held high, her steps firm and sure. She had faced the ghosts of her past and come out stronger on the other side. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Elise knew that she was in control of it. She was free. Elise felt a surge of relief as she stepped away from Edward's cold, calculating gaze, leaving the sterile, impersonal office behind. The weight of that chapter of her life finally felt like it was lifting, as though the final piece of a jigsaw puzzle was falling into place. The settlement had been signed, and while the financial matters would continue to shape her future in some ways, the emotional chains that had bound her were now severed. For the first time in years, she could breathe without the oppressive weight of his influence clouding her every thought. "It's over," she whispered to herself, her words almost lost in the busy streets of downtown. The world around her continued on in its frantic pace, yet for Elise the noise seemed distant, as though she were standing outside of time. She had won. It hadn't been easy, and the scars of her journey would remain, but they were no longer the chains that had once kept her silent. The freedom she had fought so hard for was hers at last. The sense of accomplishment was real, but it didn't fill the void entirely. It was one thing to escape from Edward's grip, but it was another to face the world on her own, without the protection of wealth or status, without the facade of a perfect life. What now? Elise asked herself, staring at the reflection in the window of a nearby cafe. Who was she now, beyond the labels of wife, ex-wife, and victim? She had spent so long trying to fit into a role that had never truly been hers. Now, for the first time in her life, she was on her own, and the question of who she truly was seemed more urgent than ever. She knew that the process of reinvention was not a destination. It was an ongoing journey. Every day was a step toward creating the person she had always been meant to be, yet she still felt that nagging emptiness deep within her. A longing for something more, something deeper. Perhaps it was love, or perhaps it was simply the need for connection. The idea of intimacy had always been so tainted by Edward's manipulation that Elise found herself recoiling from it. She had always been the person who loved deeply, loyally, and passionately. But the bitter betrayal she had suffered at the hands of the man she had once loved had left a scar that was not easily healed. But healing was possible, wasn't it? The idea clung to her, like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. But she clung to it nonetheless. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open her heart again, but she had learned something in the last few months. She deserved to be loved, truly and honestly. Elise had a new purpose now. It wasn't just about surviving or existing. It was about thriving and making a life that was uniquely hers. One of the first steps in this journey was moving forward in her career. The freelance projects had been steady, but now Elise was ready to take a bigger leap. She wanted to prove to herself that she was capable of building something substantial from the ground up. She started networking, reaching out to potential clients, and attending events in the city to broaden her reach. It was intimidating at first, being in rooms full of people who didn't know her story, who didn't care about her past. But it was also liberating. Elise found herself becoming more confident with each passing day, slowly realizing that she had something valuable to offer the world. Slowly, the doors she had been knocking on for weeks began to open. She landed her first large project, designing branding materials for a startup that was launching an innovative tech product. It was her big break, and though it was daunting, Elise poured her heart and soul into the project, bringing everything she had learned from her past experiences into the work. The design was a reflection of herself, a woman who had been broken, but was rebuilding with strength and vision. When the company executives called her to express their satisfaction, Elise could hardly contain her pride. This wasn't just about the money or the recognition. This was about proving to herself that she was worthy of success on her own terms. With each new opportunity, she felt the confidence and satisfaction of knowing that she had earned her place in the world. But life, as always, wasn't without its challenges. Despite her professional success, Elise couldn't escape the lingering emotional wounds from her marriage to Edward. The nights were the hardest. Those long, silent hours when she found herself grappling with the loneliness that had settled into her heart. She longed for companionship, but the thought of trusting someone again, of opening up to someone else, felt almost impossible. How can I love again? She wondered, the question echoing in her mind like a mantra she wasn't ready to answer. But as the days passed, Elise started to shift her focus. She began volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering support to those who had experienced the same kind of betrayal and heartbreak that she had endured. It was cathartic, healing even. Elise was able to see her own pain reflected in the faces of these women, and by helping them rebuild their lives, she was helping herself in return. In many ways, she realized, it wasn't just about recovering from the past. It was about using her experiences to make the world a better place. Through her work at the shelter, Elise met others who were rebuilding their lives, women of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life. Many of them were mothers, daughters, and sisters who had been through unimaginable pain. Yet here they were, fighting to rebuild, to heal, and to empower one another. Elise's own story, as painful as it was, became a beacon of hope for others. She shared her journey with them, not as a woman who had it all figured out, but as someone who had been broken and had learned to rebuild piece by piece. One evening, as Elise sat in the quiet of her apartment, reflecting on her journey, a thought struck her. Maybe I don't need to know exactly what comes next, she mused. The future didn't have to be a well-defined path. The uncertainty, while frightening, also held an immense amount of possibility. She had learned to trust herself, to believe in her own strength. She had learned that even in the face of pain, she could move forward. The past, as painful as it was, no longer defined her. She had found herself in the rubble, rebuilt from the ground up, and now she was ready for whatever came next. Elise smiled, her heart full of hope and promise. "I'm enough," she whispered, and for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. She wasn't broken anymore. She was whole, and she was ready to face the future, no matter what it held. Elise stood by her window, staring out into the sprawling city that had become her new reality. It had been months since she left Edward, months since she had begun rebuilding a life that was hers, not defined by anyone else's expectations or cruelty. The sunlight was beginning to set, casting golden hues over the skyline, a reminder of the beauty that could still exist even after a storm. The journey had been long, and at times the weight of her past had nearly broken her, but she had survived. She had not only survived, she had begun to thrive. But as the days passed, Elise felt the pull of something she hadn't expected, a deep, quiet yearning that whispered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just loneliness, it was something more profound, something that was slowly surfacing as she continued her journey of self-discovery. She had spent so much time focused on healing, on pushing forward, that she had never stopped to think about the future beyond the immediate steps. What did she want for herself, truly? Was it enough to simply be free, or did she want more? Did she want to experience the kind of love that had once been so important to her, despite the bitter taste left by her past? Elise shook her head, clearing the doubts that had settled like dust in her mind. She wasn't sure if she was ready for love again. She wasn't sure if she could let someone in, not after everything that had happened. The scars left by Edward's betrayal were not so easily erased, and yet, in the quiet moments when she was alone, she couldn't deny that there was a part of her that longed for connection. Genuine, deep, untainted by manipulation. Can I ever trust someone like that again? She wondered, as the question gnawed at her. It was a question that didn't have a clear answer. But even in her uncertainty, there was a shift in her heart, a recognition that she deserved love that was kind, real, and unselfish. Love that saw her for who she truly was, not just what others wanted her to be. She had spent so many years giving of herself to someone who had never truly seen her, and now she knew she had to protect that part of herself. Elise's thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of her phone. She picked it up, seeing a name she hadn't expected to see. It was a number from her past, someone she had long since written off: Sophia. A sudden rush of emotions flooded her chest. Sophia had been one of her closest friends during her marriage to Edward. She had been the one to listen to Elise's deepest fears, to offer comfort in the darkest times. But when Elise had left Edward, Sophia had disappeared from her life as if the friendship had never existed. Elise had always wondered what happened. But now, seeing her name on the screen, it was like the walls around. Her heart began to crack open again. "Hello," Elise answered, her voice tentative but curious. "Elise, it's Sophia," came the voice on the other end, thick with emotion. "I know it's been a long time, but I've been trying to reach you. I'm so sorry for how everything ended between us." Elise's heart tightened in her chest, a mix of hurt and confusion swirling within her. She had always assumed Sophia had turned her back on her, that she had chosen Edward's side in the end. She had never expected an apology, never expected to hear from her again. "Why now?" Elise asked, her voice steady, but laced with vulnerability. "Why, after all this time? Where have you been?" Sophia hesitated, and when she spoke again, her voice was small, filled with regret. "I was scared," she said quietly. "I didn't know how to be there for you when you needed it the most. I know I should have stood by you, but I let fear guide me. Fear of losing everything I had. Edward was powerful, and I was afraid of crossing him." Elise listened, her heart heavy. The wounds were still fresh, but she could understand the fear that had driven Sophia away. She had been the same, paralyzed by her own fear for so long. "But I should have been there for you," Sophia continued, "and now I want to make things right. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try. I've been following your progress, Elise, and I'm so proud of you. I can't tell you how much I admire your strength." Elise's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined that Sophia would acknowledge her strength, let alone admit the mistakes she had made. The words were a balm to her bruised heart, though they didn't erase the past. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Sophia," Elise said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But I'm willing to listen. Let's start there." The conversation continued, with Sophia apologizing profusely and Elise listening, processing the emotions that bubbled to the surface. It wasn't easy, and it didn't erase the pain of the past, but there was something cathartic about speaking openly about the wounds they had both ignored for so long. As the conversation drew to a close, Elise felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was simply about acknowledging the pain, accepting it, and allowing room for healing. "Thank you for reaching out," Elise said softly, the sincerity in her voice unmistakable. "I'm not sure where we go from here, but we'll take it one step at a time." After hanging up, Elise sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling in. She had spent so long avoiding the past, trying to push it all aside, but maybe the real healing would come from facing it head-on. She wasn't ready to embrace Sophia fully, not yet, but she was open to the possibility of reconciliation. It felt like a small, tentative step forward, but it was a step nonetheless. Elise knew the road to healing wasn't linear, It wasn't about one moment of clarity or a singular choice. It was a process. And this conversation, this unexpected turn in her journey, had opened up a new chapter. It was a reminder that the people could change, that forgiveness was a choice, and that sometimes even the people who hurt us the most were still capable of seeing the light. As the evening settled in, Elise looked out her window once more, the city lights now twinkling like stars in the darkened sky. Maybe this is the beginning of something new, she thought. Maybe this is how healing happens, slowly, quietly, and in ways I never expected. With that thought, she closed her eyes, feeling a quiet peace wash over her. It wasn't all figured out, and there was still so much to navigate. But Elise knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the woman she had been. She was someone new, someone strong, someone ready for whatever the future had in store. The city felt colder than usual that evening, the chill of late autumn creeping through the streets, settling deep in the bones of anyone caught out after dark. Elise walked briskly through the bustling avenues, her breath misting in the air. The day had been productive, filled with meetings and client calls that reassured her of the new life she was building, a life she could be proud of. Still, her heart carried the weight of a question that had lingered in the back of her mind for days. Was it possible to ever truly let go of the past? She had made peace with much of it, but there were still pieces that seemed to hold on to her, refusing to be left behind. As she walked through the dimly lit streets, Elise felt a pull, a strange, undeniable instinct that nudged her to take a different path home. She had walked this route countless times before, but tonight it was as if something unseen beckoned her forward. Her steps slowed as she approached a subway station, a familiar but unremarkable place where the sound of trains rumbled deep underground. It was a place she often passed by without a second thought. But tonight, something was different. At the foot of the stairs that led down to the platform, a figure huddled against the cold, tucked into the corner of a graffiti-splashed wall. The man was slumped, his back against the stone, a tattered coat wrapped tightly around his frame. For a moment, Elise thought it might be just another homeless man seeking shelter in the city's underbelly. But then, something in his posture stopped her in her tracks. There was something about him, an air of recognition that tugged at her. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. No, it couldn't be him, she whispered under her breath. But the nagging feeling refused to let go, and without thinking, Elise approached him. As she got closer, she saw the pale skin of his face, streaked with grime and time. His unkempt hair, which had once been meticulously styled, now lay limp, dirty, and wild. His eyes were closed in restless sleep, his lips slightly parted, and for a moment he seemed almost peaceful. Yet there was an undeniable aura of desperation that clung to him, a shadow of a man who had lost everything. Elise's breath caught in her throat as recognition swept over her like a tidal wave. "Edward," she murmured softly, almost to herself, the name slipping from her lips without hesitation. The man stirred, his eyelids flickering as if he had heard his name. But when his eyes opened, they were bleary and unfocused. He blinked several times, his vision swimming as he tried to make sense of the world around him. His gaze landed on Elise, and for a brief moment there was confusion, as if he didn't know who she was. She stood there for a long second, unsure whether she should speak or wait for him to recognize her. It was only when his mind began to clear and the fog of his disarray lifted slightly, that his expression shifted. Recognition sparked in his eyes. "Elise!" His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days, and the weight of the word hung heavy between them. The world around them seemed to slow down as Elise took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, to not let the emotions rushing through her overwhelm her. She had not seen Edward in months, and seeing him now in such a broken state left her with a strange mixture of feelings: anger, sadness, and something she couldn't quite define. He was no longer the powerful, arrogant man who had once controlled her life. This version of Edward was fragile, defeated. She had once feared him, but now the sight of him so vulnerable filled her with a quiet sorrow. He tried to push himself up, but his movements were slow and uncoordinated, as if his body were no longer his own. Elise moved instinctively to help, kneeling beside him. "Let me help you," she said gently, her voice soft but firm. Edward flinched at the touch, as if he hadn't expected kindness. His hands, once so self-assured, trembled as they reached for her. "What are you doing here?" His voice cracked with emotion, and his eyes, wide and desperate, searched her face for answers. "Why are you helping me?" Elise didn't answer right away. Instead, she guided him carefully to a nearby bench, sitting him down gently, her hand steady as she supported him. She noticed the hollow look in his eyes, the gauntness of his face that had once been flush with arrogance. There was no trace of the confident millionaire she had known. The man in front of her was broken, tired, beaten, and completely defeated. "Because I can," she said quietly, her gaze softening as she looked at him. The words seemed simple, but there was an underlying depth to them, a truth that came from a place of deep understanding. Elise knew that offering help didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean forgiving him for the pain he had caused her. But it meant recognizing that even the cruelest people could fall, and even the most broken needed a hand to lift them. Edward's head fell into his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Elise could hear the faint tremors in his breath, the weight of years of pride, greed, and regret finally breaking free. For a moment, there was silence between them, a painful silence that stretched on, filled only by the sound of the subway rumbling in the distance. Then Edward spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I've lost everything. Everything I had. I didn't know how to keep it all together." His words were fragmented, heavy with the shame of his own failures. "I treated you like dirt, Elise, and now look at me." Elise swallowed the lump in her throat, her chest tight. She could feel the rawness of his regret, and though part of her wanted to push him away, to remind him of all the ways he had hurt her, something stopped her. "We don't let the fire make us cruel," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "You've been burned, Edward. But it doesn't mean you have to turn into the fire." Edward looked up at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You can still say that to me, after everything I did?" His voice was weak, desperate, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or perhaps just the desire for redemption. Elise nodded slowly, her expression unwavering. "I'm not here to punish you, Edward," she said, her voice gentle yet firm. "I'm here because we all deserve a chance to heal, no matter how far we've fallen. I won't let you drown in this." She stood up, brushing the dust from her clothes as she looked at him one last time. "I'll get you some food. You need to eat, and then we'll figure out where you're going from here." She paused, offering him a final look before she turned to leave. "You can't keep running, Edward. You have to face the consequences of your actions. But you don't have to do it alone." As she walked away to get him the food he needed, Elise felt a strange sense of peace. She had helped him, not because she owed him anything, but because she had learned that kindness was sometimes the most powerful tool for healing. Edward might never fully understand the gravity of his actions, but Elise knew this. He was a broken man, and she would offer him the compassion she had found within herself. It was a gift, not for him, but for her own peace of mind. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how to face the future. The days that followed Edward's breakdown were strange, disorienting for both of them. Elise kept her distance, but not out of anger, more out of necessity. She knew the importance of boundaries, especially now. Edward had been humbled in ways she never imagined possible, and while she had seen a glimpse of remorse in his eyes, Elise couldn't afford to let herself get too close, too quickly. She had spent far too long in the shadow of his cruelty. She couldn't allow herself to become entangled in that darkness again, no matter how much the old him seemed to have vanished. But even with that cautious distance, there was a shift. Every day, Elise would bring him food, simple, nourishing meals. She'd offer him a place to stay for the night, never asking him to explain himself or reveal all the details of his downfall. She didn't need to know everything. His silence, his retreat into himself, said enough. And though Edward had been a man who once held all the power in their marriage, now he was just a man who needed help, like so many others who had fallen from grace. It was a strange kind of equality between them now. He had lost his wealth, his influence, and his pride. And she? She had found something much more precious, her sense of self. On one particularly chilly evening, Elise found herself standing on the small balcony of her apartment, staring at the city lights in the distance. The wind tousled her hair, and her thoughts swirled in patterns that had become all too familiar over the past few weeks. It had been a long, strange road since she left Edward, and yet she was still surprised by how much of him lingered in her heart. Not because she loved him in the way she once did, but because she had never fully let go of the idea of who he was, who he could have been, or what they could have shared. But now, standing alone in the cold night, she realized that there was no point in holding on to someone who couldn't hold on to themselves. "Maybe this is the final lesson," she whispered to herself, feeling the weight of the realization settle in. Letting go doesn't mean you've failed. It means you've freed yourself. But even as she told herself this, she wasn't sure if she fully believed it. She still felt a sense of guilt every time she walked past Edward's makeshift bed in her living room, every time she handed him a meal, every time she saw the broken man who had once been her husband. There was still a part of her that wondered whether she was enabling his despair by helping him. After all, wasn't she doing what she always did, helping him without asking for anything in return? The old Elise would have wanted answers, would have demanded an explanation for every moment he had betrayed her. She had to admit, this new, kinder version of herself wasn't easy to understand. As the days passed, Edward grew quieter, withdrawn, yet the signs of life began to show. He started to eat more, his physical health improving, though the mental battle was far from over. Elise noticed his hands, once so firm and controlled, were now more relaxed. They shook less, and he began taking small steps towards the person he could be. A person not defined by wealth, power, or privilege. Elise couldn't help but feel a faint hope stirring inside her. A cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, this man could rebuild himself into someone worthy of the second chance he so desperately sought. One evening, after Elise had finished work for the day, she returned to find Edward sitting in the small living room, looking out the window as though lost in thought. His back was hunched slightly, his face drawn with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet contemplation. For a moment, Elise paused in the doorway, unsure of what to say or do. Everything between them was still fragile, like a delicate glass sculpture poised to shatter at the slightest misstep. "Elise," Edward's voice broke the silence, and she felt her heart tighten at the sound of his gravelly tone. She had gotten used to the hushed quality of his voice, the way his words seemed to weigh heavier than before. It was as if he had no choice but to speak softly now, as if the old bombastic Edward, the one who had once commanded attention with a single word, was no more. She stepped into the room, her gaze cautious but not unkind. "What is it, Edward?" Her voice was calm, yet there was an underlying sadness in it, a sadness she couldn't hide. I've been thinking," he began, his hands fumbling with the edge of the cushion on the couch. "I don't deserve your help. I don't deserve your kindness." He met her eyes, and for the first time since she had found him, there was a glimmer of the man she had once known. A man full of pride, yes, but also capable of recognizing the extent of his own failures. "You don't have to say that," Elise replied gently, taking a seat across from him. She leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap as she focused on his face. "I'm not doing this because I expect something from you, Edward. I'm doing this because I know what it's like to lose everything, to be so far gone that you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel." Edward's expression shifted, his lips trembling as he swallowed hard. You shouldn't have had to go through that. You didn't deserve what I put you through." His voice cracked, and for a moment Elise saw the man who had once been her husband, the man who had loved her in his own twisted way. But there was something different now, something deeper than the shallow affection he had once offered. "Maybe I didn't deserve it," Elise said, her voice soft yet steady. "But it's in the past now. We don't let the fire make us cruel." The words she had spoken to him days ago echoed between them, hanging in the air like a fragile truth neither of them could deny. She wasn't going to allow the bitterness of their past to consume her any longer. She had let go of the anger that had once fueled her, and now it was time for him to do the same. Edward sat in silence, absorbing her words, his head bowing slightly, as if the weight of her forgiveness was too much to carry at once. The silence stretched on, but Elise didn't feel the need to fill it with words. Sometimes silence spoke more than anything else ever could. Finally, Edward's voice came again, quieter this time. "I want to make things right. Somehow. I want to rebuild, but I don't know how. I don't know where to start." Elise looked at him, a mix of sadness and hope in her eyes. She knew that Edward's road to redemption would not be easy. It wouldn't be something that could be fixed with a few kind gestures, or even the promise of change. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could rebuild himself, not for her, but for himself. "You start with yourself, Edward," she said softly. and you take it one day at a time. As the night settled around them, a quiet peace filled the room. Elise could still feel the weight of the past between them, but there was something else there, too. Something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of hope. Edward wasn't the man he had once been, and perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps it was only in breaking down that he could truly rebuild. Elise had learned that she could not change the past, but she could choose how to respond to it. And in that choice, there was power. She stood to leave, her heart lighter than it had been in days. "Take care of yourself, Edward," she said, her voice quiet, but full of meaning. "We all have our battles, but you don't have to fight them alone." Edward nodded, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Thank you. For everything." Elise left him there in the quiet comfort of the apartment and walked into the night, feeling the weight of her own journey, her own healing. She didn't know what the future held for them, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She had found strength in forgiveness, and in that strength, she had discovered the power to let go and to live again. As the first days of spring began to break through the cold grip of winter, Elise found herself walking along the same streets she had walked many times before. But now, everything seemed different. The air was fresher, and the sunlight felt warmer, as though nature itself was shedding its old skin and making way for something new. She had always loved the changing of seasons, how each brought with it a sense of transformation, a promise of renewal. But this spring, it felt more personal. It wasn't just the world outside that was changing. It was her, too. Edward had come a long way in the past, several months. The man who had once been too proud to admit his flaws was now the man who, every day, made the conscious decision to rebuild himself. It wasn't easy. There were days when his past would rise up like a dark shadow, reminding him of his wrongdoings and his failures. But each time it happened, he found the strength to face it, not with the arrogance that had once defined him, but with humility, the kind that only comes after one has been brought to their knees and forced to look inward. Elise had watched this transformation from the sidelines, offering her support, but never pushing him. She had learned, too, that people couldn't be fixed. They could only fix themselves. Her role, if there was one, was to walk beside him, no longer as his wife, but as someone who had once shared in the wreckage of his life and now stood beside him as he rebuilt. There were moments when they would talk about the past, about the things they had lost, but more often than not, their conversations were about the present and the future, the new lives they were forging in the wreckage of the old. And then there was the forgiveness, the thing that had eluded both of them for so long. Elise had spent years carrying the burden of her own anger, the bitterness that had consumed her after everything Edward had done. But with time, she had learned that holding on to that anger didn't hurt him. It only hurt her. She had to forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved peace. Forgiveness wasn't a gift she was giving Edward. It was a gift she was giving herself. Edward, too, had struggled with forgiveness, both for himself and for the people he had wronged. But somewhere along the way, he realized that he couldn't move forward without releasing the weight of his past. It wasn't just about what he had done to others. It was about the damage he had done to himself. He had spent so many years living in the shadow of his own mistakes, believing that he was beyond redemption. But he wasn't. He had learned that forgiveness was not an erasure of guilt, but an acknowledgement of the opportunity to change. One evening, as Elise sat on the balcony, watching the city below, Edward came out to join her. He had been quiet lately, thoughtful, and today was no different. There was a pensive look in his eyes, the kind that told Elise he was working through something important. He sat beside her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. It was a comfortable silence, one that they had both grown accustomed to, filled with an unspoken understanding that they no longer needed words to communicate. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice low and steady. "I've been thinking about everything, about us, about the past, and what comes next." He turned to her, and for the first time in a long while, his gaze was full of clarity. "I know I can't change what happened. I can't take back the pain I caused, or the things I said to you. But I want you to know that I'm not the man I was. I'm not the man who made those mistakes. I'm someone different now, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. For everything." Elise's heart ached as she listened to him, the words that had been so difficult for him to say, now coming out with the sincerity and weight they had always lacked. She could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, the vulnerability that had once been masked by arrogance and pride. And in that moment, she knew that the man sitting next to her was no longer the man who had cast her aside so carelessly, but someone who had truly recognized the depth of his actions. "I forgave you a long time ago, Edward," Elise said softly, her voice filled with a gentle calmness that reflected the peace she had found within herself. "Not because you deserved it, but because I needed to let go. I needed to heal. Holding on to that anger was only keeping me from moving forward." "And you've done the same, haven't you?" Edward nodded, his eyes misting over with the emotion that had been building inside of him for months. "I have. It's not easy, but I've learned that forgiveness isn't just for the other person. It's for me, too. It's a way to stop living in the past, to stop punishing myself for things I can't undo." Elise reached out, placing her hand on his. There was no need for further words. Everything had been said. The years of pain, the bitterness, the anger, and the regret, they had all led to this moment, a moment where forgiveness was not just a concept, but a reality. They had both learned that in order to truly heal, they had to forgive, not just each other, but themselves. They had both been broken, but through the process of rebuilding, they had become whole again. As the sun set behind the skyline, casting a golden hue over the city, Elise and Edward sat together in a quiet peace. The world around them was changing, and so were they. They had come a long way from the wreckage of their past, and though they couldn't erase the scars, they had learned to wear them with grace. In the days that followed, Elise continued to build her business, her career thriving in ways she had never imagined. She had become not just a survivor, but a force in her own right, a testament to the power of resilience and determination. Edward, too, had found his footing. He had started a small consultancy business, helping others navigate the challenges of rebuilding their lives after setbacks. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was the first step in reclaiming his identity, not as the ruthless millionaire, but as a man who had learned the true value of humility and hard work. Their paths had diverged, but in some ways they had come full circle. They were no longer the people they had been when they first met. The love they had shared was no longer bound by the chains of the past, but by a mutual understanding of what it meant to grow, to forgive, and to heal. They were different now, not just because of what had happened, but because of what they had become in the process. And so, as the seasons continued to change, as life moved forward with its inevitable ups and downs, Elise and Edward both found peace. Their story, once filled with pain and betrayal, had become one of renewal. It was a story of resilience, of growth, and most of all, of the transformative power of forgiveness. They had learned that sometimes the greatest strength doesn't come from holding on, but from letting go. And as they both walked into their futures, separate but forever intertwined in spirit, they knew that they had not only healed themselves, but had created a life that was truly their own. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was all that really mattered.